Hello. In this session, we'll be looking at the story model as a framework to be thinking about throughout the course. It's called the story model framework, and as you can see, this presentation will be about creating a new story for adult learners. The outside of the model have frames of knowing, or how we learn, and they're important to remember because they are occurring all of the time with everything that we as an individual are doing. The closest and nearest one to our ways of knowing is our own personal story. Who are we? What are our beliefs? Colors everything that we know. Secondly, there's the cultural story, then the global story, and then the universal story. So I will talk in a minute about what these stories looks like by using Joanne and my story. Surprisingly, Joanne and I have known each other for a very long time. We grew up in the same neighborhood, and so we had a sort of similar cultural story. We went to the same public school, but it wasn't until we became high school teachers in the same school that we really got to know each other. We're both veteran teachers with the same philosophy, and while I went off and became a university professor, Joanne worked for the Ministry of Education and worked in the area of assessment. We both have the same cultural story in that we are Canadians, we live in a North American context, and have a Eurocentric background. As well, the cultural story we grew up with was a meta-narrative of the white Protestant males who were the masters of the universe, got all the jobs, had the power. And today, this meta-narrative is being challenged on many fronts. For example, with the new woke culture that is emerging, that is definitely anti-meta-narrative. The global story, of course, is different for everybody in the world now. Highly populated planet. The internet, though, has made us a global village, and we're all interconnected and interdependent. Some major problems, of course, plaguing our planet right now, like climate change and food security and greatest migration of people in history. So there's many, many wicked problems that are interdependent and interconnected. And so this is one way of looking at our world where we can talk to others, connect with others, and see our place, because what happens in one place affects people in another place. The universal story just speaks to the fact that we are all humans with the same kind of basic needs, the same kind of emotions, the same way of making sense of beauty. And one of the things that keeps us similar is that we all make sense of the world through story. We have a personal story, and our stories shape our identity. But there's also more than a personal story. There's also a global story, and that's what we're looking at here today. So just to go back to the picture for the moment, you can see that the frames are around the story itself. The inside is about how we are going to create a new story, not just for us as people, but for us actually as a planet. I, Susan, have been working for a long time with the story model, since 1992. That makes it old in some senses, but this model has made sense of the world, at least for me, for all of those years, and is particularly valid right now. Let me tell you why. Looking at the present day story today, it is in flux, crisis, or transformation. I would very much say it's in crisis at the same time as it is in transformation. But to really understand the story, we need to look at the values, both positive and negative, in all the different stories. So another part to understanding the present day story is it has one foot in the old story and another foot in the anticipated future. So it's never just a static piece of time. And as well, as we've already looked at, it's filtered through the cultural, global, and universal lens. We need to go back and look at the old story to understand where we are. And to do this, we need to deconstruct the old story to find the values. This is important because it's actually the values that drive the story. The story will continue to be the same as long as we act upon the same set of values. And these values may be either positive or negative. As well, the values are often implicit. We don't even understand that we have these values and that they are driving us. But we can identify the values by looking at what we do rather than what we say. So if I say to you, I'm a constructivist teacher, and yet everything that I do is lecture to you and then give you tests at the answer for looking to see if you understand, then I'm not really a constructivist teacher at all. But there is a new story. It's happening all the time. There's always a new story emerging. So what we need to know is that we have the power to change the story. And again, the new story is driven by values. So if we pick the kind of values that we want, for example, we want to live in a world where we can do collaborative decision making, that's a value, then we can consciously construct the story to move in that direction. The new story is really the best of the old story, so we don't want to throw the old story completely out. There's lots of great things to the old story. And what's realistic in the emerging new story? And another piece of this whole thing is it's a back and forth, push and pull between the old and the emerging story. There's a lot of tension there. As I mentioned in the last slide, the push and pull is experienced as a dialectical process. It's like a tug of war or like a pendulum swinging. It will go back and forth, back and forth. For example, in politics, you might look at it going left to right, or right to left, right to left. The dialectic may take many years to resolve. One of the ways that it did resolve is in seatbelts is a good example of a new story that everybody accepts. But it wasn't all that long ago that people did not have to wear seatbelts. So now you have to, and there's a number of reasons for that. But the biggest one is education and research, followed by legislation. So that's just one example. There are many news stories happening as we move along here. Once there's a new story on an issue, then there's always another one. And so you're never stopped with the process of creating new stories. Here are just some examples of news stories that are happening even as I speak. And I'm sure you all can identify with many of them. There's been a dramatic change in most professions and possibly in yours. Probably in yours. The introduction of AI, ChatGPT, and similar platforms is shaking the world, and it's shaking the education world because really it throws into question what is knowledge and actually how do you measure what somebody actually learns and what skills do we actually have. It's turning the world upside down, and that's just beginning right now. Another story that's very much in process is the LGBTQ story, the issues around woke culture, transgenders, people. There's all kinds of things happening in that area. And again, it's a push and a pull, push and a pull, push and a pull, till we come to some kind of resolution. Incidentally, that's what has happened also with the abortion issue in the United States, which did seem to be resolved, and now suddenly is not resolved again. So you can see it's still a push and a pull going on in policy in the United States over that issue. Marijuana is actually a new story here right now in Canada. I think pretty well everyone accepts that it's a new story, and that's not a very long story in the making. I think just a few years since Trudeau brought it in when he was first elected. So now there's also other stories. Lots of people don't smoke anymore, although third world countries often still do. We have euthanasia in some first world countries. Here in Canada, it's known as MAID. So there's lots of different things, and I'm sure that you can look around and see them happening. Migration story, all kinds of things. And is there a new story in adult education? The catalyst for change, as far as I understand them, the new story is, number one, education is a huge thing. And of course, education comes in all shapes and sizes these days. It's not just classrooms with teachers standing in front lecturing to their students. A great deal of it is research, followed by legislation. Most change happens through legislation. Huge changes happening through social media and technology, all of which I'm sure touch your lives every day. And the final piece is, if there is going to be a news story, I need to be involved. My story has to reflect the news stories and my beliefs and my actions. Looking specifically at education, you can see we've come a long way from the one-room schoolhouse to the network teacher, the network classroom. From the old to the new story. So what are practices in the old story? Some I think you'll probably recognize as a learner. It's considered that all the learners are the same. They're on a conveyor belt and they all get exactly the same experiences and come out the same at the end. The professor lectures, the learner's passive, there's standardized testing to really compare you with other people. And it is, again, like a conveyor belt. The big piece of this is there is accountability for individuals and for systems. And in the end, we can compare and we can set up competition. What's important here is, how is knowledge conceived? And here it is, there's one right answer, there's a real truth. Scientific method is used for research, and that's how you find the truth. And you can be objective, you can be quantified, you can predict and control, and in the end, you can be the master of your universe. So the values embedded in this story are pretty clear when you look at them. It's dominated by the left brain thinking, linear procedural thinking, and things that we can get from that are we can compete with each other, we can be objective, we can dominated by hierarchy and power. Knowledge is power, the old saying. We can predict and control, and we can socialize people to be the way we want them to be. This keeps the status quo. Just to look at the model again, you can see in the middle there the arrows going two different ways. So there are these tensions that are here between the old and the new story. And where we're going from here, one direction is, if we keep doing everything exactly the same way, based on exactly the same values, we'll just keep going and it'll become more and more negative. But on the other hand, if we choose some other set of values that we prefer, we can start to move towards a preferred story. Usually those preferred story values are pie in the sky, some of them. And so we have to pick the realistic. So the dialectic is trying to go between what's really good still in the old story that we want to keep and what's realistic in our goals for the new story. And how do we bring these two together? How do we resolve them? So here's some of the tensions in the old and the new story in adult education. Does it need to be accountable or does it need to be relevant? And people often see these as not going together. Is it going to be traditional education or is it going to be more holistic and constructivist? Is it teacher-directed or learner-centered? Are you going to measure results by standardized measures, or are you as an instructor going to be able to create your own test, and it can be performance-based? And finally, something you're going to learn in this class if you're not familiar with yet, is it just going to be assessment of learning, summative assessment, or is there going to be a lot of formative assessment, which is called assessment for and as learning? These are the tensions moving back and forth, the basics that are moving back and forth, either or. The new story for adult learners is one that you're probably pretty familiar with, at least in theory. So, as we know, this kind of learning values people's backgrounds. So there's space and choice for the self-directed learner and who you are when you come to the learning. but there's also other things happening at the same time. It's going to be inquiry driven. It's going to have lots of technology probably. There's multiple literacies and 21st century skills I'm sure you've heard about. It'll probably be a constructivist classroom. As I said, we know that adults bring their own lives to the learning and their backgrounds, and you can't really change that. There's a dynamic interaction with the instructor and the student, and usually there's some global connection, especially since so much of the learning is online, and therefore automatically you're connecting to a much larger network. Finally, there's going to be differentiated and personalized learning and assessment strategies. And in adult learning, there is really a lot of self-assessment, because the highest goal is to be able to assess yourself and to know that you have reached the measure that you wanted to reach. Part of the reason why we put this in the very final part of the course. Here quickly are some of the trends that are happening in the news story. They're all the old traditional literacies that we learned when we went to school, and they're usually thought of as discipline-based, but there are a lot of new literacies as well. Environmental literacy, you must agree, particularly right now, is very important, but there's other things like character education and moral literacy and visual literacy. Right now in schools, they're putting in financial literacy because they realize how important it is that students K to 12 understand what's happening with their finances before they become adults. And of course, one of the literacies you've heard about for a very long time, critical literacy. Something you may hear again and again as you're going through your academic work is that we have to learn, then unlearn, and then relearn. This is what people are finding. It's a new way of thinking about learning. That for now, we need to be intrinsically motivated, especially as adult learners. And so different kind of movements have emerged. For example, passion-based learning and challenge-based learning are different ways of addressing the learner wants to go in their own direction and do their own thing. At the same time, there's often accountability measures going on. So there again is the tension. So knowledge in this view of the new story is different than it was in the old story. It's collaborative. And there are many answers to many questions. So there's a whole postmodern element to it. Knowledge is co-constructed. One example is Wikipedia, that I know gets hard shrift often from academic professors, but there are other places when it's considered the real source of knowledge because it is vetted and brought together and thoughtfully constructed. I'll leave that one up to you. Knowledge, though, is uncertain, indeterminate, subjective, and multiple realities. There is not one truth. And a big issue today is false information, as you know, fake news, and just how are we ever going to know the difference as we go along with the new things that are happening with technology? So maybe the most important one here is that metacognition, that's knowledge of ourselves, knowledge of how we think, how we can problem solve. Self-knowledge is a very important piece to the adult learner. This is one of the issues that does come up in this course. Is the knowledge that you are responsible for teaching procedural, or is it concept-based? Is it something that's linear, lockstep, been passed through an accredited system, so you have to do it exactly that way? Or do you have the creativity to think of it in a different way, knowledge that is more concept-based, for example, mindfulness? So these are terms that you're going to come up with as we go through the course. So in the end, how do we resolve the tensions and move forward? Sometimes it's not just resolution, sometimes it's just reconciliation, because with the gaps so wide that we somehow learn how to reconcile them. Or sometimes we can synthesize a thing and come up with something entirely new. But what we're really looking for is both and. We want a system where we can be both accountable and relevant. So that's a really important piece for moving in further into the 21st century. There'll be traditional parts, and there'll also probably be opportunities for holistic, constructive part. It can be teacher-directed in parts, it can be learner-centered, it can be discipline-based in parts, it can be transdisciplinary in parts. There might be some standard tests, but hopefully there'll be project-based learning, some other performance-based tests that demonstrate that the learner actually has learned it. And there will probably be more and more of assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning. Not just one or the other, but all three intertwined. For me, what's exciting about the story model, and it's based on a lot of theory on narrative and story, is that you and we have the power to change the story. So as a society, we can shape and change the story. And we need to do that recognizing it's driven by our values. So to be able to identify what our values are, what is it we want to keep in, for example, adult education as we move forward. So it's the best of the old story and the emerging story. And then we also have to remember that there's going to be an ongoing dialectical process between a tug of war between two different sets of values. But if I believe in the values of the new story, and I personally do, I need to both tell the new story and I personally need to act on it. So, you are being called to adventure in this course, ADED 4F72. Let's make that new story together. Thank you.